Hello, webinar attendees. We will get started shortly. My name is Maurrasse, and I serve as the Vice President for Network Leadership with Campus Compact. We hope that you and your families and your communities are staying healthy and safe and taking care of each other. We want to start with a land acknowledgement, but also a twist on our traditional land acknowledgement. So as a step towards honoring the truth and achieving healing and reconciliation, Campus Compact seeks to acknowledge the traditional native lands on which we occupy. Given that we're gathering for today's webinar from across the country and some from around the world, as opposed to moving into sort of traditional, sometimes performative land acknowledgements, I'm going to share our resource that helps us to rethink the way that we do land acknowledgements, especially in response towards issues around repatriation of land and working closely and in communion with local Native communities. So those are two resources that I offer to folks as a way to begin to nuance, criticize, and evolve land acknowledgement statements beyond performative ways. We also want to recognize and stand in solidarity with those individuals who are continuing to call for racial justice and equitable communities and affirm that Black Lives Matter. And we at Campus Compact commit to move beyond words and into programs and actions that fully embody a commitment to full participation and equity. So we're really excited to have you part of today's webinar titled Higher Education's Response to the COVID-19 Pandemic, Building a More Sustainable and Democratic Future, with our three speakers who will be introducing themselves shortly. I do want to do some plugs for some Campus Compact programming. We have our upcoming Campus Compact National Conference, which will be virtual. Proposals are open and you can submit up until the 25th. So I'll put that link in the chat. I also invite you to take a look at our featured initiatives, including our communities of practice, our credential programs, and other programming that Campus Compact offers. In addition to that, if you're interested, we at Campus Compact are happy to do open houses with your institutions where you can invite members from across your institution, and we can talk about all the resources that are available to folks from member campuses. If you're interested in that, you can feel free to email me. I'll put my email in the chat and we would be happy to accommodate. So with that, I will turn it over to Ira, who will begin our webinar. Thank you, Ira.
Thank you, Marisol. It's a pleasure to be doing this for Campus Compact, an organization that I've had the great pleasure of working with since its founding, and it does great and important work. My name is Ira Harkavy. I'm founding director of the Netter Center for Community Partnerships at the University of Pennsylvania. I also serve as chair of the International Consortium for Higher Education, Civic Responsibility, and Democracy, and founding chair of the Anchor Institutions Task Force. I was one of the co-editors of the book that we're going to be discussing today with two of the co-authors of that, not co-editors, but co-authors of that volume, Brian Murphy and David Maurrasse. Let me just provide a little context to what this book is about and why this book was produced. The issue of why we would do a book on higher education's response to the global pandemic and how it happened. What had occurred was that a group of individuals, myself and some people from Europe, who were part of a global cooperation we have that both Brian and David are involved with. A global cooperation includes the International Consortium for Higher Education, Civic Responsibility, and Democracy, the Council of Europe, the Organization of American States, and the International Association of Universities. That global cooperation for the democratic mission of higher education is established to precisely do that, to deal with the issues of how higher education could contribute significantly to democracy on campus, in the community, and in the wider society. And the crisis of the pandemic led a group of us to write a piece for a newspaper. And the piece was on, in fact, the need for higher education to do something and do something much more significant. But we also were looking at the fact that what the pandemic revealed so terribly graphically is not just the crisis itself that it produced, but the incredibly chasm-like inequalities that affect our societies in the United States, in Europe, and indeed around the world. And in fact, made that graphically revealed and also revealed with the starting with the killing of George Floyd, but of course killings that have gone on historically, and the ongoing catastrophe of American racism, and in fact racism that all over the world, because demonstrations resulted on issues of Black Lives Matter or related issues all over the world, and then issues related to the pandemic, to inequality, gave the sense that this could not be business as usual. So we actually did a call for authors, and we did a call, and 43 authors from around the world produced 31 chapters in the briefest amount of time, because the sense of crisis, that something had to happen, and had to happen significantly to move things forward. But as we recognized that, we also recognized, and this was the basis of the book, that higher education did respond in an incredibly powerful way to the pandemic. But this was more than a crisis of health, and it was more than going to, as we found out for sure, this was going to be more than a brief crisis. This was a profound crisis of democracy, and in fact leading to crises that would be deeply affecting the whole function of democratic societies. And although we focused initially on the issue of public health, it was clear that more had to happen. So we put this volume together, and again, two of the co-authors are with me who wrote chapters in that book. And what we found was fairly, not surprising, but I think significant. In the first level, what we found is that the issue was the significance of higher education's response, the extent to which higher education really did rise to the occasion. A well-known European scholar on the issue of higher education engagement, Ellen Hazelcorn, said it was heroic, the response, the initial response. We know a number of things that occurred, which in that response, from issues related to health, to shifting campuses to online activity, but clearly that much more had to happen. And then when looking at the response that we looked at carefully, besides the significance of higher education's response, and David will be speaking about research that he's been leading and doing about higher education and other anchors' response to the pandemic. When, in fact, using David's chapter, it was clear that something extraordinarily significant was happening, but also, given that significance, a lot more still remained to be done, and what was going to be happening as the pandemic changed and things moved forward. What we also saw when we looked at the responses was the extent to which there was deep local issues involved with universities working in their environment, and working in their environment deeply in partnership, trying to deal with the profound problems that were existing because of the pandemic, and what the pandemic again revealed in terms of the market-based and historically based racism, in terms of issues of extreme inequalities, and inequalities that were widening. And again, the issues deep of racism, and how both visible and how imperative it was to act in that regard. So where that was occurring was in the locality of universities. And we saw that, for instance, one case of extraordinary interest when people have discussed this is how from the Belfast University having projects in Northern Ireland, and then the development in Ireland itself, at Dublin University of Technology, and in fact how dealing with these problems and dealing with them in separate localities but joining together had very significant implications for the whole struggle around Ireland and Irish unity, and what kind of developments will happen in the future. And then besides seeing the issue of locality, what came across as probably the central theme is the need for a new kind of university. That this could not be business as usual. There was no return to normal. The status quo ante was not acceptable. That something different had to occur. And there was a call in the book for something like, and the term we used and a number of authors used throughout the book, was a democratic civic university in which its primary purpose would be the advancement of democracy democratically. To advance democracy democratically on campus, in the community, in the wider society, and the call that this had to happen, that this was a necessity, that we couldn't, in fact, we had to go beyond the pre-pandemic university, which failed to effectively address, to sufficiently address, to effectively combat the frightening problems that exist and the crisis facing democratic societies all over the world. And then we concluded with a what's to be done. And we didn't have a clear step-by-step way forward. But what we called for was indeed the development of this democratic civic university, and a call, though, to develop really a global movement. To looking at the work of the International Consortium for Higher Education, Civic Responsibility and Democracy, which my two colleagues and I, and actually Maurrasse, are members, and are also membership in a broader global coalition, broader than that, with the Council of Europe, with the Organization of American States, and with the International Association of Universities, to call on a strengthening and expansion of that movement, to engage universities, university leadership, government leadership, students, faculty, and staff, to in fact make that issue of dealing with the crises that were revealed by the pandemic and the pandemic itself as an ongoing focus to assure the future of democracies that are in great peril. And that call that's open and that we ended with is something, of course, that we have to work out together. But we felt that it was imperative to have a global movement and learn from and with each other to make a difference. So that's the background of the work. And the most important part of the volume, of course, is the work that was done by the authors who gave descriptions to this type of activity and what it meant. And first, I'm going to turn to David Maurrasse, who will introduce himself, but I just want to introduce his chapter. And to introduce his chapter is to say that David provided an extraordinarily important chapter that framed the conversation around what higher education has done in response to the pandemic, providing a national overview that set the stage for many of the other chapters. With that, I will turn to David Maurrasse.
Thank you very much, Ira, and thank you, Maurrasse and Campus Compact. Appreciating the opportunity to speak to all of you, and appreciated the opportunity to contribute to this very important book. First, I'll say a little bit about myself. I'm David Maurrasse, and I'm the founder of a company called Marga Incorporated, which provides strategic advice and research to philanthropic initiatives and community partnerships. Part of the work of Marga Incorporated is coordinating the Anchor Institutions Task Force. As Ira mentioned, he's the founding chair of the Anchor Institutions Task Force, which has been around since 2009. The task force really promotes the role of higher education and other anchor institutions in community and economic development, and various ways in which to strengthen and bring about equitable communities. The task force has done quite a bit over the course of recent years and recent months, and I'll mention a little bit of that over the course of my comments, just so we're on the same page in terms of how we see this concept of anchor institutions. I always like to provide our definition. We see anchor institutions as organizations that are enduring and remaining in their geographical settings and playing a vital role in their local communities and economies. Institutions of higher education are really the preeminent anchor institutions in many cases because of their embeddedness in their localities, as well as the breadth of resources that they bring to the table, from intellectual resources to physical, to economic, to human, and other forms of capital. And so a lot of our work is promoting the ways in which institutions of higher education can tap that capital through collaborative relationships in communities with a values orientation. So the task force promotes particular values, including a commitment to democracy and democratic practice, a commitment to social justice and equity, a commitment to place, and a commitment to collaboration. So I wanted you to have that background. And so when we think about the situation of anchor institutions like colleges and universities being rooted in their communities, they really exist in an interdependence with their local communities. And the pandemic, as well as other current occurrences over the course of the last couple of years, have really illuminated that interdependence in a very stark way. And in many ways, higher education really was forced to respond to the pandemic almost immediately. Of course, from an internal perspective, higher education was challenged on many levels. It's very functioning and way of being in terms of holding in-person classes and having an environment on campus for exchange and dialogue and communication and connection was all disrupted by the pandemic. So there's that reality in itself. And the other reality in higher education is there's great inequality across institutions of higher education. And so that was also illuminated in a very important way in the pandemic as well. So that is also important to keep in mind. What the chapter referred to was the range of ways in which institutions of higher education responded to the pandemic. I should also note to you that the Anchor Institutions Task Force has been really since the beginning of the pandemic, been gathering examples of how institutions of higher education and other anchor institutions have been responding in their communities. So we have actually produced 4 editions of these examples. We actually released one just a couple of weeks ago, and it really captures the range of responses as the pandemic has evolved. Of course, in the early years of the pandemic, there were particular types of responses needed in terms of immediately shutting down as institutions as they needed to do, but also immediately responding to health and economic needs in the communities, doing things like contributing to local funds. What a lot of institutions of higher education, of course, also had to do was look at inequality on their own campuses. Moving to online learning really forced many students who could not afford computers and could not afford internet access and didn't necessarily have the home environment that was conducive to online learning. Many institutions of higher education really had to come through with computers for students so they could actually do that, as well as doing that in the local community and for local public school students in their communities as well. So that was a very important way in which institutions of higher education have responded. And then when we think toward the later stages of the pandemic, obviously vaccination has become an important issue and continues to be. So many institutions of higher education have really been put in the position of leveraging their physical capital, first of all, in terms of their spaces so that they could be sites for vaccination, as well as the research aspects and the intellectual capital that institutions of higher education have been providing in terms of understanding vaccinations and their impact and contributing to continuous learning about vaccinations and their particular role. There's so many other ways in between in which higher education has been responding in terms of contributing to food banks or serving as sites to distribute food, knowing that this has been such an important part of what has happened over the course of the pandemic, and so many other interesting creative ways. Ira mentioned heroic ways of responding. So when we think about medical schools and different health professions on campuses, being in the position of graduating students early so that they could begin working immediately to work on solving the challenges of the pandemic in health institutions. As one example of one of the things that was done in sort of an immediate way, distributing PPE, creating PPE, as many institutions of higher education were in a position of developing masks and other forms of PPE and distributing them in their communities. So there really is a wide range of different ways in which institutions have responded. When we think about an institution like Rutgers University, Newark, which has really been a champion in our field and in our work in the Anchor Institutions Task Force, an institution that continues to be truly community-centric in its approach to working locally. They were certainly a major champion in responding, especially responding in a way for their students and their student body really being one that is very diverse and includes many lower income students and students of color who actually needed immediate attention as it relates to access to technology, as well as access to food and nutrition and other resources. So when you look at an institution like that, a public institution, it also internally is confronted by limited resources. And of course, when we think about the limited resources that confronted states during the pandemic and how that affected state funding for institutions of higher education, public institutions of higher education, we look at a very challenging situation. And so, as Ira mentions, the heroism that we've seen from institutions. I mean, here's an example of an institution that really did have a heroic response, facing their own economic challenges, but never really ceasing their commitment to the community and to their student body. So that's something I think is important to remember. One of the lessons I find that's so interesting about this pandemic is that, and hopefully we don't know really what this means long-term in terms of an appreciation for this role of anchor institutions in communities, is that the necessity of anchor institutions in their locality, I think, was really illuminated during the pandemic because of the crisis underway and how local governments needed institutions of higher education and other anchor institutions to respond, whether it's using their physical site, whether it's for other types of resources, whether it's for human capital. So I think in some ways we saw a level of collaboration and coordination in communities by necessity that we might not have seen otherwise. And so when we think about a college like Miami-Dade College and how they have been an important public site for first testing and then ultimately vaccination. Really, they were actually the first federal vaccination site in the country. That is a real example of how institutions of higher education play an, in fact, necessary role in trying to confront these kinds of challenges. So in this crisis context, institutions of higher education, health institutions, other anchors were really turned to operate in the service of the public in the locality and to really advance public needs in a very direct way. So that, I think, has been important as well. For us, as we look ahead with the Anchor Institutions Task Force, there are a few things that come to mind for us. First of all, we had to adapt ourselves, an entity that once depended on an in-person conference in our programming. We really shifted and pivoted pretty quickly as the pandemic came upon us and focused really on three things. One was to continue to showcase examples of how anchor institutions are responding in their communities. As I mentioned, the different editions that can all be found on our site that have been published, really extensive, numerous examples of institutions of higher education and other anchors responding in their communities in a variety of different categories. So it's very much organized like a reference guide. So we've got 4 of those. And what we've also been doing is finding ways to showcase the voices of anchor institutions, of anchor institution leaders and their responses through webinars and other forms of communication. A second thing that we've been doing is continuing to provide a space for different clusters of anchor institutions and different peer groups within anchor institutions to continue to exchange and learn from each other. For example, we have a higher education presidents subgroup which has met throughout the pandemic. We have an economic development professionals subgroup, which has met throughout the pandemic. And these have always been important exchanges for us in the Anchor Institutions Task Force, but they took on a different role over the course of the pandemic because they really became environments for peer sharing and frankly, peer support as institutions were really navigating so much uncertainty and still even dealing with some degree of uncertainty as we continue to move forward. But the third thing that we've been doing that I think is so crucial is that we really have been thinking about the policy implications for the kinds of responses that we've been seeing from institutions of higher education. As I mentioned, the necessity of this work has really come to light. As we look to the future and think about the devastation that communities have experienced under the pandemic, economically, health-wise, educationally, and in other areas, it's hard to imagine communities really bouncing back, and not to say we want to return to quote unquote normalcy, but when we think about a future and reimagining a future for communities, it's hard to imagine no active role for anchor institutions and colleges and universities. In fact, I would say the active engagement of anchor institutions in solving problems and working collaboratively locally is in fact essential to the future of the communities, given the degree of devastation that has been experienced as a result of the pandemic, and then exacerbated through the pandemic, and then also thinking about some of the other crucial issues that have been continuing to come to light over the course of the last few years, such as our racial reckoning, and such as challenges to democracy, which I think are very important to keep in mind as well. But we have developed a policy brief, another specific resource from the Anchor Institutions Task Force, which is on pursuing just and equitable communities in the wake of COVID-19, which we produced at the end of last year. It's calling for a fund for anchor institutions to support the kind of work that a Rutgers University Newark is going to do, whether or not it has substantial resources, but could do that work so much more effectively if it had additional resources. There are certainly many institutions of higher education that responded to the pandemic. What we know from experience in the Anchor Institutions Task Force is that there are some institutions that are exceptional in terms of being engaged in their community and committed to that over the long haul. And what we want to do is provide greater support for those, what we like to call community-centric anchor institutions, to contribute to their communities. And the other specific policy suggestion that we're calling for in this brief is a national work initiative, which is to support the role of anchor institutions in developing and guiding and supporting the kind of work that will be required for the future. Obviously, numerous industries were impacted forever as a result of the pandemic, and then there are new industries that will be developing, and these are the areas where there are work opportunities, but there's also important work that needs to be done at the community level, whether it's through the nonprofit sector or through some form of volunteerism. All of this kind of work has implications for the role of higher education. And we want to provide support for that as well. So we've been circulating this policy brief really extensively. So in wrapping up, I will just say that doing this work for some years and observing how it's evolved, it has been incredibly encouraging to see the level of engagement and the level of response by institutions of higher education during these crucial times. I mentioned the pandemic, but even also our racial reckoning, as we've seen numerous institutions of higher education make statements, and we've seen some institutions of higher education go even beyond statements and developing new policies, new practices, changing the names of buildings, moving statues, historical recognition on levels that we've never seen before, Juneteenth as a holiday, in so many different instances. I mean, the institutions of higher education were also responding to the racial reckoning underway. And I think we've even seen some courageous action among institutions of higher education over the course of the last couple of years. As we look forward, as we think about where higher education is heading, I think we have to try to figure out what does sustainable courage look like in higher education, not only in terms of relating to the communities, but in terms of becoming anti-racist institutions, but then also thinking about the role of higher education in democratic societies, which is so important to the content of this book, and so important as we think about the future of higher education. A commitment to democracy, which is one of our values in the Anchor Institutions Task Force, really shouldn't be considered as a left or right thing. It should be considered really as central to what higher education is all about, certainly in the United States context. So in addition to experiencing a pandemic, which has had health and economic impacts, which has exacerbated inequality, going through a racial reckoning, we've also seen direct attacks on democracy over the course of the last several months as well. And what is the role of higher education in addressing that as well? And so as we think about what sustainable courage looks like in higher education, there are numerous different considerations that I think are really interrelated. They're not necessarily separated. And so I think that that's one of the challenges ahead. So I will stop there.
Thanks very much, David, for that excellent presentation. Let me just highlight a few things that will lead, I think, into Brian's talk, because I think you've captured really some of the major themes and highlighted them. The issue to just put a point on it, David is emphasis on what higher education has done during this period. He also has emphasized something very important, that going forward, higher education has to play a dramatic and important role. That role that occurred during the pandemic and during this period of the pandemic is something that has to continue and continue, but even the game has to be up significantly. The issue of how to respond to these questions is that even with the outstanding response of higher education now, one of the questions that gets asked is the extent to which higher education has not done what it could and should do for democracy, to be anti-justice and anti-racist and justice-seeking institutions, anti-racist and justice-seeking institutions, that in fact, given the significance of higher education, given that it's a primary economic engine that has such tremendous human resources, given its role as helping to new discoveries and technologies, that the current crises we face, to what extent is that a sign of higher education's failure? And how do we build then from what we've done positively and make it greater, stronger? I love that idea of sustainable and built into continuous courage. I think is very powerful. So even with all the great things in the civic engagement movement, clearly the conditions of society that we knew about, but were so profoundly revealed by the pandemic, given what was revealed by the killing of George Floyd and so on, many other Black individuals, given what was revealed, as David emphasized, on January 6th and continues, what is higher education's role to come up and how we have to change what's been done and move it forward. And he also highlighted something about a phrase that's very significant, community-centric anchors, and we're about to turn to one. Because with the extraordinary work that's occurred in work in Rutgers, Newark, and other places around the country, one of the early beacons has been on this work with tremendous student leadership, has been the work of the Anza College. And although Brian was, when he wrote this essay, was no longer the president, I'll let him describe his situation. He was a president for many years that helped move that institution with its students and faculty and staff and community members precisely in the direction of community-centric anchors. And another component of a democratic civic university has to be inclusion, has to be the people who in fact have been excluded. And the role of community colleges and other institutions in that core activity of creating an inclusive democratic campus as part of an inclusive democratic community, society, and world is the kind of role that the best of our community colleges do. And with that, I'll turn to Brian Murphy.
Well, thank you. I want to acknowledge right up front that we have an anti-democratic technology problem.
That's right, we do.
Which is Marisol has been trying to figure out how we could get the gallery view of the Zoom thing so that we could actually see everybody who signed in.
You know, we miss you. It's hard to do this.
She's toggled to attendee view. And, you know, with all due respect to the four of us, this is aggravating to not actually see who we're talking with.
We wanted to have a conversation, and it's hard to have a conversation if we can't see you. So we really love to figure out a way to hang out together. So Maurrasse is working on, Maurrasse does everything well. So if anyone could fix it, she'll do it well. But Brian, going beyond technology, could you tell us what's up with your chapter, the work you've been doing, and what we need to do going forward?
Well, I'd like to suggest two things. One, I would have asked, had I been able to see everybody, whether or not, or how many of the persons who are here are from or in the community colleges. That would be very, very helpful to me, because it's always helpful to know what person's living experience is. And so it's a little hard without knowing that.
Folks can put that in the chat. So if you want to use the chat function as a way to communicate and be in community with the attendees, feel free to do that.
Okay. Let me situate the account that I was asked to provide for this book in the context that Ira suggested in the beginning, and then sort of build out from it. The conversations that happened amongst those of us who were working on the international collaboration during the initial months of the pandemic were pretty fraught with real anxiety regarding what was happening in our multiple countries. And of course, it was very different. What was happening in South Africa was different from what was happening in France or Venezuela or any of the other places where persons were reporting from. The idea of the book was to bring together people who spoke from those different experiences to see if we could learn from each other with concrete proposals, as both Ira and David have suggested, regarding higher education's capacity or ability to play a more advanced role or a more substantial role in protecting democracy, democratic practices, democratic access. And so the book emerged out of a kind of hurry up and quickly report ethic. And Marisol will probably give you a way of finding the book. I'm not hawking the book so much, just to say that there's some really very moving stuff from people who are on the ground in different countries. That said, I was invited to submit something on the role of, or the response of what in Europe would be seen as open access institutions, in our context, community colleges. And how had those institutions particularly both been affected by and responded to the pandemic, and what could we learn? I had been the president at the Anza College, which is a public 2-year community college in the Silicon Valley area of California. I had had that role for about 14 years and left 3 years ago, but I was still pretty much in touch with my friends and colleagues who were working there. And so using that as my base, but also talking to people across the state from other community colleges, I tried to get a sense of what was happening and what was going on. I was particularly interested in the narratives that emerged about the pandemic and what was happening to students, and was disheartened, candidly, to see that the sort of dominant public narratives were, on the one hand, the speed and alacrity with which the Research One universities responded to the pandemic. Certainly in my own town, I live in San Francisco, the work of the bioresearch people at the University of California, San Francisco, was astonishing. Its collaborativeness, its immediacy, its intelligence, its outreach to the communities in our city was really quite exemplary. But when the narrative turned to America's community colleges, who enroll half of the undergraduate enrollment in the United States, and half of the graduate of comprehensive universities are transfers from community colleges, the narrative was this sort of depressing story of victimhood, and that the poorest among us would be served the least, they would be harmed the most, marginalized more, and the colleges would once again find themselves savaged by external forces. At one level, of course, a lot of that is true. Enrollment dropped across the country. It was very, very difficult for the resources to be gotten to students when campuses suddenly and quickly pivoted to online. But if you look closely at a number of institutions, and obviously I was looking at De Anza, a whole different story emerged. a really incredibly important story emerged. And that was what I would call the resilience and the resistance of the students themselves. The immediacy with which they responded both collaboratively, affectionately, in solidarity with one another. De Anza is a big place, about 22,000 students. It's an enormously diverse place with a significant number of first-generation students, low-income students, immigrant students, a lot of deferred action on undocumented students. And so by any of the nominal rubrics, the instant that the campus pivoted to online, the obvious question was what was going to happen and how would students be served? The institution itself responded incredibly quickly to pivot to online and distributed $1.8 million in federal CARES money to their students for laptops, deals with Verizon to get access points. But at the same time, the students themselves were going through a crisis of employment, housing, transportation. Half of the students at De Anza lost their employment in the first month of the pandemic. 63% of the students who had experienced housing difficulties by previous polls had housing difficulties and unemployment. Almost half of the students in the California community colleges that were polled, and that's a population of 2.1 million students, those polled, about half of them were experiencing anxiety, depression, significant mental health challenges. But the real story was the resistance of those students, the capacity to mobilize their own networks. And that was expressed at De Anza in an astonishing figure, which is that the persistence rate of enrollment from winter to spring quarter, De Anza is one of the 2 colleges that has quarter systems rather than semester systems. In fact, enrollment, the persistence rate dropped 2%. And in the summer it grew. So here are students who are increasingly unemployed, increasingly under pressure at the epicenter of the epidemic itself. One of our staff members in an early Zoom call astonished us all by reporting that 5 members of her extended family had died. In the midst of that, students used the networks that they had created over the previous couple of years to sustain one another, to get meetups when they could physically do it. And then when the George Floyd murder occurred, those same students were in the streets of San Jose and San Francisco and Oakland. And so the stories, which were young people are in the streets, masked the fact that a lot of those young people in our region were low income, non-white community college students, most at risk, most in danger of both the pandemic infection itself and whatever police brutality might occur during the midst of the epidemic or in the midst of the demonstrations. So I and my colleagues were at pains to try to understand not the victimhood, but the resistance and the resilience. And going forward, how could institutions better encourage, sponsor, support, not back away from the political engagement of our students? Because in all the talk of, quote, institutions of higher education, the focus very often is on the administrative response, which at De Anza was astonishingly quickly, the faculty response, which was also quick, but very often there's less attention paid to the response of our students. The work that they did during the pandemic to sustain one another, support one another, help one another in the most basic things, study groups, conversations in anticipation of exams, all of the stuff that sort of everybody takes for granted in face-to-face residential colleges. Here was commuter students, low income, dispersed across a region under extreme pressure, trying to figure out how to stay in school, get their work done, and at the same time, play a public role in defense of the anti-racism movement and in the expansion of it. The students, before anybody ever got back to campus, the students at De Anza were making demands on the Board of Trustees to defund police positions, in which they were successful preliminarily, to fund new counseling positions for African-American students, in which they were successful. So they were doing their political work at the same time they were doing their academic work. Now, the broader lesson of this, to jump ahead, the broader lesson of this for me and for my colleagues when I was speaking with them was, what would a return to normal look like if you wanted to sustain the political energy that students across the country so often exhibited? And I have a slightly different take. It's not significantly different than David's, but it's a different view on this. The resilience, the immediacy of transformation, the engagement that David, you spoke about, that's true. And at the same time, it's almost mind numbing to listen to the language of, quote, returning to normal, as if the only issue were vaccine cards and getting back into the classroom and getting back to where we were before this all happened. And if we were to get back to where we were before all this happened, Rutgers Newark would still be doing astonishing work in the city of Newark. Miami-Dade would still be doing astonishing work in the city of Miami. De Anza would still be doing what it's doing. But all too often, the social racial segregation that marks higher education in the United States would be just the same and not changed. And so if I'm looking forward to who are going to be the forces to assist higher education in its goal to be more equitable, in its goal to be more responsive, I have to say among the highest and most important of those resources are the students themselves, that insofar as they organize, what's the task of administrators and faculty? I'm tempted at one hand, get out of the way. On the other hand, you could say more positively and agreeably, find ways to support it, find ways to be helpful. Because if democracy is going to be saved in a fraught environment, students will be engaged politically across higher education in the run-up to the 2022 by-elections. That's what the next year is going to be about in many, many cities and towns. That then is a preamble to the elections of 2024. Democracy, in my view, democracy is in significant peril in the United States. So what role can institutions that are constitutionally pledged to nonpartisanship, who are legally bound to be nonpartisan, what role can they play when students mobilize and probably honestly disproportionately mobilize on one side of that partisan divide? So I think that challenge, which is a different challenge than investment strategies in low-income communities. It's a different challenge than employment strategies that large institutions should be doing in cities like Philadelphia and New York and Houston and San Francisco and Los Angeles. Those things that the Anchor Institutions Task Force has really elegantly crafted and pushed and advanced. All of that's extraordinarily important. But I do think facilitating and supporting the political activity of students as it emerges over the next 2 years is going to be critical. I won't, frankly, bore you with the details of what went into the what happened at De Anza, except to say 3 quick things. There was a multi-year investment in community-based work among De Anza students. We have an Institute for Civic Engagement, VIDA, the Vasconcelos Institute for Democracy and Action. We have a certificate program in social change leadership. There are in pivotal positions throughout the college, there are people who care deeply that our students feel engaged in their community. It is all scrupulously nonpartisan. And at the same time, it never backs off of supporting the students who are protesting around immigrant rights, who are working for affordable housing, who are supporting a living wage campaign, who are working in transportation equity. So that the college's identity over a period of time has become associated with students who are engaged in their communities, politically active. That's part of what you get when you come to the college for your education. And then when they transfer, as they do in the thousands, to the University of California or to the California State University, they bring with them skills that are not only academic. Trust me, they're damn good academically. they do really well, but they also bring skills that those universities will want and need for student leadership, for mobilization, for asking of universities that they do more than they currently do. The final thing is just an editorial comment to, it's not repeating exactly what I said before, which is Ira pointed out, this is not uniquely an American question. This is a question everywhere. The resurgent nationalist forces, the kind of faux populist neo-fascist forces in Europe, the emergence of a populist, in my view, authoritarian political party in the United States. These questions are on the minds of everybody from France to Venezuela, from South Africa to the Middle East. They are among the dominant questions. How are universities going to respond if they are perceived by major political forces to be the enemies of the nationalist retreat? All of the good things that David pointed out universities have been doing around questions of race, those do not go unobserved by forces of reaction. And so one of the things that I think would be very good for us to talk about was experiences other of us have. How can we help one another understand, if we're going to protect liberal education, we're going to protect equity, we're going to protect diversity and inclusion, we're going to do so in an increasingly hostile political environment. Not so much in California. Christ, I can say things in California that a president in Texas would have trouble saying. But we got to work with each other, because I believe it is going to get more difficult and more tense and more contrarian and more partisan over the next year and a half. Enough said.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks very much. I want to highlight, if I could, a few points you made and extend them a bit for to take your good comments into a way that connects, in fact, directly to issues that you posed and the book poses. So if I could just say, I think the book itself and the primary argument of our conversation is there can be no return to normal. There can be no return to. Nancy Canner says that in her chapter, and my chapter had the same conclusion. This issue is that the issue of posing that in the wake of Black Lives Matter, in the wake of the pandemic, in the wake of the savage inequalities, that normal was entirely unacceptable. So that Nancy Canner will not do the same thing she did at Rutgers Newark. And David indicated, in fact, I think something that the notion that you emphasized too, that even the best of the work has to increase its game. It has to increase its game. And it seems to me that in one instance, what we all argue together and are emphasizing is the notion that as good as the response was to the pandemic, the historic antecedents and what universities failed to do has dramatic impacts on the state of the current society. And that takes us to the next point, which you said, Brian, which I think has to be highlighted. What we do now and going forward, as David emphasized with the legislation of AITF and emphasized with the policy brief, what we do now going forward will profoundly shape the nature of the society we live in. We are not, in the words, an epiphenomenon. Higher education is core. And the issue that we've all emphasized is from all parts of higher education, from, quote, research ones to regional universities, state universities, land-grant universities, community colleges, have profoundly significant roles to play and significantly shape the society we're in. And we have a charge to do something and make a difference and to do something profoundly. And the other thing the book argues, I think, is this is an international question. The extent that we had colleagues from Asia, Africa, of course, Europe, mostly in the United States, writing on similar issues about the issue of inequalities, about issues of racism, about issues of the need for greater social justice, out of a need for greater inclusion, and the need to deal with the rise of massive and anti-democratic forces that universities have to be engaged in that, from issues affecting Europe. In just today's New York Times, there's an article about a coalition in Czechoslovakia that came together to fight against the current president in an election because he is a leader of an illiberal democracy like Orban is in Hungary. This is a worldwide phenomenon. So the issue that we need to do is deal with higher education's, the extent it's engaged in those issues and combats those issues will be absolutely crucial if we're going to create the kind of society that we want to have. Otherwise, it won't have. And that really was the core argument of the book. And I should say one thing last, and then see if the comments. The International Consortium, I should say, is comprised of Campus Compact and the Anchor Institutions Task Force and the Democracy Commitment and the American Association of Colleges, Association of American Colleges and Universities, the AACE, that these groups came together precisely because of the issue that we need to work in global combination and solidarity to deal with these profound global threats. But the only way to do it is to do it locally, in our communities, in our regions, in our countries, and do it around the world. But unless it occurs locally, and that was one thing the book emphasized, this work really will not be able to advance. We have to create those relationships, I think, that David so well highlighted and emphasized. So I want to say, if there are any other issues, critiques, questions that my colleagues have of each other, any statements about the summary, because I know we're closing up in about 3 minutes. If there's any chat from the floor that people want to raise, any questions, critiques, concerns, footnotes.
I'll just chime in since
Yes.
we have a few minutes on it and saying that what Brian presented as a distinction doesn't have to be so. The role of universities in supporting and expanding community engagement could also be extended to supporting and expanding student activism. Mm-hmm. So whether they are generally operating in distinct ways, and whether that's not an emphasis of the work of the Anchor Institutions Task Force, they don't have to be separate. And so as we reimagine, I certainly don't believe I ever suggested we're returning to normal. Right. We are trying to reimagine the future of higher education and push higher education to another level in its commitment. But I really do appreciate your emphasis on students, because that is important. We have to remember that we're probably not having the kinds of conversations about the role of universities and communities, or about anti-racist universities and what universities can do to challenge systems of inequality without student activism, because it was student activism that brought us to this point. And I say this as a former student activist myself. So we do always have to remember the life cycle of how this work forms. And maybe we do, as Brian suggests, need to bring it full circle.
Mm-hmm. I think that's Brian, any final words on your part?
No, I agree. I wasn't meaning to suggest they're opposites. Was meaning to suggest they're different tendencies. And so I am very encouraged by the amount of work that universities, the pivots that universities went through to combat the pandemic. I was more encouraged by exactly what David just said, by the amount of activism that emerged from students. But I was most deeply impressed by the degree to which those were the most at-risk students, the students most challenged by both the pandemic and the economy, that they were not standing around. They were doing their work.
I think that the issue, and turning to Maurrasse, I want to just thank, first of all, the opportunity to do this together, and say that I think that the idea of this may be a period when we really all can come together, building together the growth of the student movement and supporting students in this work, and that people in roles that we have, from faculty, students, and staff, making the question of democracy the primary question for universities in the United States and around the world. That's what the book's about, and I think that should be our call going forward. Thank you very much, Marisol.
Thank you all so much, and thanks to our attendees for staying. This webinar is recorded and will be on our Campus Compact website in a few weeks, so be on the lookout for it. And thank you so much. Until next time.